Thank you all, and happy week before Thanksgiving. I'm glad you're here and not home making turkey. We want to start, as always, by thanking our founder. The festival wouldn't be here without him, and neither would any of these events. Jamie Kabler. We also want to thank Jordan Schnitzer, who is the underwriter of all the Writers Series events. And thank you, Jordan. As always, our angels in the front few rows, they fund 85 to 90% of our festival. None of us would be here without them. Thank you, angels. As most of you know, the city of Rancho Mirage is our partner. Obviously, we hold our events in this gorgeous library. Well, today, all of the city council members can't be here because we are swearing in our new mayor, Steve Downs. Congratulations to Steve. As always, after the presentation, our author will be signing books, so if you'll line up against the left wall, he'll be glad to sign your book and speak to you after the show. Now, on to our presentation. We're so lucky to have James Reginato here today. He's authored several books, including Great Houses, Modern Aristocrats, and The Carlisle. He's also the writer-at-large for Vanity Fair. And I gotta tell you, his articles are fascinating. They're the ones that make you buy the magazine. Some of them have included Yorkshire's fabled estates and their problematic history. Also, Parisian luxury. My favorite is the $1,000 baked potato and caviar Caspia. So it's only logical that today he tackled one of the most rich and famous families ever, the Gettys. And to interview him, Doug Miller, a justice on the Court of Appeals, an avid reader, and you might know this, but personally, my favorite moderator. He's my husband. Welcome, James Reginato and Doug Miller.
Thank you, Debbie. That was so nice.
My pleasure.
All right.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I didn't write it, I promise. So welcome to the Coachella Valley.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library.
I'm very honored to be here.
And as you can see, this is a very literature-oriented group. So we're happy to have you here.
Thank you.
And I'm not saying this just because I'm interviewing him, but this is a fabulous book. I have pages and pages of notes of things that I didn't know. You know, I quite frankly thought I knew a lot about the Gettys, but I quite frankly knew very, very little. So we're going to have fun today. We're not going to get to everything, so that's why you need to read the book or purchase the book if you weren't given one. But let's just jump right in. Why a book about the Gettys?
You know, most of my career has been as a magazine journalist. This is going back, I don't want to date myself, at least 25 years, maybe even longer. And especially at the start of my career when I was at W magazine, part of my job was to cover society. And oftentimes, I'd regularly go out to San Francisco, and also I was lucky enough to go to England, and I'd met various members of the Getty family, and there was something very charismatic about the Gettys that I met. And, you know, I'd covered a lot of very wealthy families, but there was just something kind of next level about Gettys, just the way they lived. There was also eccentricity that the family had, but there were a lot of stories behind them, stories of tragedy, you know, myths, and, you know, you weren't sure what was, you know, real and what was not. And, you know, a couple of years ago, as I was talking to my editor, and, you know, we said, what about a book on the Gettys, just to kind of separate fact from fiction, and that's how it sort of started.
So I love the format. It's almost like a genealogical format for the book. How did you select that?
You know, even when I started this book, I didn't realize quite how sprawling and complicated the Getty family is. I mean, I was kind of mostly aware of the branches in San Francisco and the branches in Los Angeles that many of you might know, particularly Gordon and Getty. Gordon's still alive. He's going to be 90 this December. what I found out is, they're spread out on 4 continents today. I mean, J. Paul Getty, he had 5 sons. He had 5 wives. We can get into that discussion later, but that's start off things in a complicated way. But with these 5 wives, he had 5 sons. The 5th son, the youngest son, died in childhood, so there was no line there. But the 4 sons who lived to adulthood, between them fathered 19 children, and today there's something like about 50 great-grandchildren. But they're spread on 4 continents today, and they've all gone in wildly different directions, not just in terms of geography, but in terms of their interest. So it was a complicated book to sort of, because there's certain stories about the family, there's a certain narrative, but then there are all these characters and branches that come in, and it was a challenge to sort of tell the story in a kind of way that wasn't going to confuse the reader.
And how did you do research for the book? What source materials? Who were you able to talk to?
Well, the first thing I did, I was lucky enough to get access in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles to J. Paul Getty's personal papers, which include, foremost, his diaries. J. Paul Getty, from the time he was a young teenager, basically kept a diary, a page every day. And were you people he saw, where he went, sometimes what he ate, sometimes his bodily functions. He was a little strange about that. And then occasionally he would sort of like record his emotions, but he really kept that diary every single day of his life, almost, until about 3 days before the day he died. I mean, he actually did. He hand wrote them most of his life. In fact, it was a challenge. They're all in the Getty archives. And so just deciphering the handwritten entries, it was problematic. Later in his life, his secretaries typed them, and at the very end of his life, he would dictate them. But that was an amazing source of information. But also, one of the most touching things, he left, you could read letters that he'd written to some of his wives, and also some of the letters that they wrote to him. And that actually, right off the bat, kind of made me want to reassess kind of a lot of the narrative about him, because he's often depicted as this very cold, heartless character, very warm terms with all of his ex-wives and mistresses to the end of their days, and yet he ended up, in this living for years in this great estate in England, and they would often come visit him. And I think that, the book, I quickly found out the bar is much higher getting someone to cooperate with you on a book-length, format biography of their family. So in the end of the day, I did get a number of them to cooperate with me, but it took a lot of effort. A number of them didn't, but I'm kind of jumping maybe to the end, but in the end of the day, I got enough to talk to me. Also, I realized that I knew a lot of people in their orbit and their world, so that sort of was a great start. And then, just digging.
So the stars, J. Paul Getty. So
Right.
let's start with him. Tell us a little bit about his upbringing, where he was raised, and his relationship with his family.
Yep. Born in 1892. His parents were Scottish-Irish immigrants. At the time of his birth, his parents were actually really quite poor, but the circumstances changed pretty dramatically within about, the first, by the time Paul turned about 10, because his father put himself through law school and ended up doing well, open to practice, and that started thriving. And then, but the real decisive moment was when George was the name of the father. George had a client who had an insurance claim that he had to settle in Oklahoma, which was in the middle of a huge oil boom. So George looked at all this wealth being created, and he sort of raised his sights, and he said, maybe I should invest in an oil well, which is what he did, and he struck oil. So all of a sudden, the family's circumstances changed dramatically. About the time Paul entered his teenage years, all of a sudden they were wealthy people. So and that shortly afterwards, they moved to Los Angeles, where Getty kind of spent his teenage years, and then he basically started helping his father in the oil business, and his father was very much hoping that Paul would follow him into the oil business.
But J. Paul Getty wasn't so sure, but his father made a proposal and said, I'll give you $10,000, and you tell us the rest of that story.
No, exactly, because when Getty was sort of a teenager, he actually thought that he wanted to be a diplomat. But George, to entice him into staying in the oil business, made him a deal. He said, I'll give you $10,000. You can invest it any way you want, as long as it's in oil leases. And then, and then the proviso is that, I mean, George drove a hard bargain. He said, and then if you strike oil, you can keep 30% of it. But Getty, Paul, struck this huge mother lode of oil, and became, by the time he was like, all of a sudden he was 21, he became a millionaire in his own right. And there were a few years then he just sort of had a kind of a playboy life, and he was this, you know, newly minted millionaire at 21 there in Los Angeles. He was an eligible man about town. But then, I don't know.
But then he had a unique way of examining where he should do oil exploration.
Right, yeah.
Tell us why his was different than some of the others.
One of the things also was different. I mean, Paul really started out as a wildcatter. But unlike a lot of other wildcatters, he believed in science. And petroleum geology was then a relatively new science. And a lot of wildcatters kind of sneered at this. The idea that, as I said, some damn bookworm was going to tell them where to drill for oil. But Getty, you know, he had great instincts, and he definitely relied on his instincts as well. But he just thought there's something to this, and he hired the best petroleum geologist, you know, he could find, that money could buy. And because as he wrote, he thought there was got to be some logical order to the way that oil was deposited under the earth. And so he started prospecting in Oklahoma and the West, but where he really made his vast fortune was in the Middle East, specifically a tract of territory that was known as the Neutral Zone. It was a completely barren, and everyone thought worthless, desert kind of wedged between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and neither of them really even wanted it. That's why it was sort of the neutral territory. But Getty thought, he had this hunch, and again, it was kind of a bit help, but what he'd learned from these petroleum geologists, he thought there could really be rich deposits there. So he struck a deal with the emirs of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia for a 60-year lease for the Neutral Zone, which he paid a huge fortune for. And everyone, all of his peers, thought that he was going to lose his shirt, and they were laughing at him.
Telling him he should have stayed in Texas and Oklahoma.
Exactly. But in fact, he did discover just immense reserves. But even then, because it was such a barren tract desert, there was absolutely no infrastructure. So he had to build roads and railroads, and then, you know, just to get the oil to port. And then he had to build an entire fleet of super tankers. And then he had to build whole refineries. But he did all that, and then he became really one of the world's first billionaires.
And tell us how he survived this stock market crash of 1920.
Yeah, well, you know, he, unlike most other kind of wealthy people during the 20s, was not buying stock. I think he had a feeling that things were over, but there was a bubble and it was going to burst. So he, in that time in the 20s, sunk all of his money into oil leases. And then when the Depression came, he was actually in really good shape. And then he started buying up all of these, you know, collapsed stocks. And so during the Depression, he was riding high.
So I think we all perceive the Getty fortune as being the J. Paul Getty fortune. But
right.
There was really a trust created, the Sarah C. Getty Trust, his
right.
mother. So tell us how that originated.
Yeah. Well, this was started in 1934. Ironically, most people think of J. Paul Getty as this world-class tightwad cheapskate, which he basically was for most of his life. But when he was younger, his parents thought he was a spendthrift. And part of it also had to do with all of these wives and divorces he was getting. And so his mother was really an amazing woman, and she, in many ways, is responsible for the fortune of the family, because she insisted that he start a family trust, and so it was named after her in 1934.
Her husband started a family trust, George, right?
No, she insisted that Paul started.
Okay.
Exactly. But she contributed $1 million to it, and Paul contributed $3 million to it. So, as I said, that commenced in 1934. And Getty would plow all of his profits into this, basically, and this trust has just grown and grown and grown, and it's still in effect. As I understand it, and it will be until Gordon, who I mentioned earlier, who's the last living son of J. Paul Getty, he's about to turn 90. When he dies, the trust will be terminated, and we can talk into a little later if you want. But he had, meanwhile, J. Paul Getty's personal fortune, when he died, he left all of that to the J. Paul Getty Museum in Malibu, which had just recently opened.
But the trust had an interesting exception for Ronald, right?
That was his second-born son. Again, there's a lot of complicated stories in this family to follow, but Ronald was...
So do you want to tell about the 5 marriages that occurred before?
I mean, again, there's a lot to get in.
Maybe we get that part, and then
Sure.
we can get to Ronald.
Well, again, most of these marriages were very short-lived, and they were all surprisingly to much younger women than Paul. And the women kept on getting kind of young. Well, the women they tended to all be about like 20 years old when he married them. But Paul, of course, was advancing in age. But most of the marriages really happened in between the early 30s and early 40s. In fact, he basically the first 4 marriages sort of they were all consummated and over I think within 13 years. It was kind of a lightning round of marriages, and then the last marriage lasted a little longer.
I think you said, or someone said, I heard, that he was very good at falling in love, but not so good at marriage.
He liked getting married, but not being married. If you could figure out the difference there. And then afterwards, he decided it's just too dangerous to get married. Though, even after these marriages, I mean, he was a world-class kind of romancer and womanizer. He had a whole string of mistresses. But as I was saying earlier, amazingly, he seemed to keep them all on amicable terms, which is saying something.
So I found fascinating, I think her name was Finny, F-I-N?
Feeney, yeah. Feeney, yeah.
From Germany.
Exactly.
One of his wives. And he talked about how that was probably the only time he'd been outsmarted in a deal.
Well, exactly. Exactly.
So tell us a little bit about that divorce.
This relates to why their son, Ronald, was sort of cut out of the trust because, again, after this marriage went awry and he had to negotiate the divorce with Feeney, who he said was German. He went to Berlin, and this was just before World War II. And Feeney's father was a German industrialist. As Getty said, probably the only time he really met his match in business when he had to negotiate the divorce with Herr Dr. Hemley. And so he was so kind of irate at Dr. Hemley for getting the better of him. Though he wasn't mad at Feeney, it was more his father. So when the trust was written, he thought, well, Dr. Hemley is so rich, he can take care of Ronald. So that's why supposedly why Ronald was cut out of the trust. However, Ronald's children
over him.
But Ronald's children and their children are cut into the trust. It was just Ronald. But the unfortunate thing is World War II comes along, and Dr. Hemley was Catholic and an opponent of Hitler. So in fact, Dr. Hemley's fortune was wiped out. So Ronald grew up at a big disadvantage. I mean, he was still, taken by most measures, a wealthy man.
And Sarah took care of him.
Yeah,
right?
but he wasn't on a level of his brothers. But as I said, Ronald's children will inherit.
So there's another intriguing story about J. Paul Getty's purchase of Standard Oil and how that came about. So tell us that.
Yeah, I mean, Getty, the thing I found sort of amusing, he really kind of operated almost like a one-man band. He certainly grew a big company, and there was a big headquarters in Los Angeles, but most of his life he operated out of hotel suites, mostly in Europe, where he kind of just did everything by phone. But I think this was in the early 30s. Forgive me, some of these dates are now going out of my head. But he was invited to ring in the New Year at San Simeon by Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies. And New Year's Day, he gets a tip from one of his associates that the real basis of Getty Oil, which is a company that he did it by buying up all these companies, but he had a master plan to sort of build this huge consolidated oil company. But there was then a company called Mission Oil, which was sort of a linchpin of this. It's a complicated story, but in essence, he got a tip that one of the Rockefellers was willing to sell his shares in
Standard Oil.
Yeah, in Mission. It was the Mission company, you know, and but so somehow Getty, his representative, knew that he knew John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s kind of representatives, and he was able to get these shares of Mission Oil, even though the rest of the Rockefeller family it's a complicated story, knew that Rockefeller was not supposed to sign these shares over to J. Paul Getty, but he did. It was he almost hoodwinked John D. Rockefeller. He really did, actually. But that allowed him to take control of Mission Oil, which was kind of the linchpin of this huge company. And again, this was New Year's Eve at San Simeon, so it's kind of a wonderful story.
So he was deathly afraid of flying.
He was,
J. Paul
yeah.
Getty. He had a horrific flight in 1942.
Right.
He traveled to England on a boat in the early 1950s.
Yeah.
Did he ever come back to America?
Because he used to, from the time he was really a teenager, every year he would spend a few months in Europe. He loved Europe. But in 1951, he sailed for his annual trip to Europe, which he thought would last for as usual for several months. On this occasion, he never came back. He ended up again. Most of the 50s, he was still kind of this nomad, just living out of hotel suites. But a real turning point in J. Paul Getty's life was because even when he was becoming a billionaire, when the riches of the neutral zone were flowing to his coffers, he was still a relatively unknown person, which theoretically he claimed that's how he preferred it. But in 1957, all that changed because Fortune magazine did one of the very first of these so-called rich lists. They surveyed, who are the richest people in America. It's called the Richest Americans. So they compiled a list of the 75 richest Americans, and lo and behold, there was J. Paul Getty not only at the top of the list, but far above the rest. And this came out in October of 1957, and it was a huge news story for various reasons. But one, most Americans had never heard of J. Paul Getty. So there was this frenzy: who is this person? Who's the richest man in America, if not the world? And J. Paul Getty was then in residence at the Ritz in London, and he came back one day to find the lobby thronged with journalists, all clamoring to see the richest American. So he said he was basically kind of outed, and that also changed his life because heretofore, he'd kind of been under the radar, living in hotel suites, but then all of a sudden there were security concerns. So he finally had to buy a permanent house. So he bought this estate in Surrey, about 30 miles outside of London, called Sutton Place. It's a fantastic sort of Tudor-style estate from the 1600s. And I opened my book with kind of a scene of Getty shortly after he'd moved in, but it was actually just early 1960 when he moved in. But the touching thing is, it's now, I think he's now just about turned 67, and all of a sudden this is the first permanent home he's had since he was a teenager. And he'd lived there basically for the last 15 years of his life, but he never went back to America.
So tell us about Sutton Place, kind of what it was and what happened there.
Yeah. Well, again, it was both his, business headquarters, but his home. It was 72 rooms, great, yeah, sure, and from the 16th century. And, there are great stories. I mean, Henry VIII had visited there. And also fantastic gardens and grounds. And he had this, his sort of executive staffs were there, but then also he had this wonderful butler, Bullymore, who's kind of a running character in my book, and who sort of, he ran the house, he was like Carson the butler, if you went on Downton Abbey. He was kind of and to jump up forward a little bit, one of the charming things in my book, we go back, fast forward about 30 years after J. Paul Getty dies, and his son Gordon and Ann are very wealthy in San Francisco, and they build this kind of palatial house of their own in San Francisco. So after Getty died, Gordon and Ann hired Bullymore and his right-hand parks to be their butlers in San Francisco. So there's this sort of charming continuity. And also, one of these things, Bullymore and Parks, the under butler, were actually a couple. And it's kind of a marvelous love story between those two. And the idea of these two gentlemen sort of, uprooting from, and Bullymore, in fact, had been a butler to Joseph Kennedy in the 1930s when he was American ambassador to the court of St. James. And so when he then arrived in San Francisco in the 70s as Gordon and Ann's butler, he sort of became this kind of local celebrity himself.
So I think one of the reasons you wrote this book, at least what you say in the conclusion and afterward, is kind of to dispel some of the myths.
Right.
And so one of those myths was that J. Paul Getty was kind of stingy or cheap. And
no, that was true. That part was true. Okay.
Well, okay. But
yeah.
There's a great story about what happened with a payphone at Sutton Place in England.
Yeah, I guess that's that. There are other myths that I found not to be so true, but the cheapskate part, that was pretty much true. Because again, his parents were these Scottish-Irish kind of immigrants, and there's a certain, flintiness that comes with that background that he, clung to him all of his life, no matter how wealthy he got. But yeah, the payphone is sort of this, kind of famous thing that he ordered. But as I found out in my research, it actually wasn't his idea. There's a woman who was one of his longtime mistresses, and probably his last living mistresses. Her name is Robina Lund, and she's still alive in Scotland. She's in her 90s, but I was able to speak to her. And she was also kind of functioning as his kind of legal affairs, legal advisor. And she told me the payphone was actually her idea because at the time, international calls were incredibly costly. And they found out people were coming to J. Paul Getty's parties and running into the library and calling up Tokyo. They would literally, they found out people would be on the phone for hours to Tokyo or Los Angeles. And at the time, these would cost tens and thousands of dollars. So Robina said, we have to put our foot down. Of course, J. Paul Getty thought it was a great idea. I'm not saying he didn't go along with it. But so they did install this famous payphone. But he said, in his inimitable way, it was for the convenience of his guests. He said I think I found this in one of his letters or diaries. He said, for all right-thinking guests, he said that they would find it very daunting to charge their host for an international call.
So I want to go back to the museum and talk a little bit about that. So when did he start to collect art, and why did he start to collect art, and why a museum?
Well, it was actually in the 30s that he went, there was a period where he actually lived in New York, and it really, the one time in his life he kind of lived it up, like I say, it was ironically during the Depression, but he rented, some of you might be aware of this, the address of 1 Sutton Place South. There's a kind of a palatial apartment, and it had built by the Phipps family, and Amy Phipps, who then married Winston Guest, who then they had CZ Guest, who many of you probably might be familiar with. Mrs. Phipps was one of the great collectors of English and French furniture of his time, and I think they must have been a little down on their luck because during the Depression they rented it out furnished to J. Paul Getty. So he, living with Mrs. Phipps' furniture, some of the great examples of French and English furniture. He became really interested in decorative arts to begin with, and so that's what he started collecting. Of course, during the Depression, he was rich; he could buy up, get all sorts of bargains. That's how it started, and then he sort of graduated to Old Masters, and he really started studying and learning. He was very methodical about the way, how he sort of taught himself about art and the market. But then in the 50s, he was able to buy this ranch in Malibu, which is where the original J. Paul Getty Museum would rise, 20 or something years later, the one that's in the form of a Roman villa. But so I think from the time that he was, in middle age, he realized that this is what he wanted his legacy to be, to build this collection and you know, leave it as a museum.
And he never went there.
Well, that's the thing. You know, so like I said, because of his mostly fear of flying, that he was in Europe, he started planning this museum very seriously, I would say, in the 60s, 1960s. But he did it all remotely, and how things were done. We did obviously before
Zoom,
all this stuff. But he would literally have them take Super 8 movies, and they would, you know, ship it to 6,000 miles away and they would send plans, send photographs. So he micromanaged its construction, you know, from 6,000 miles away. And even the design of it, it was his idea to build in the form of this Roman villa. So it finally opened in 1971. This was a few years before he died. He was pretty elderly at this point. And even, you know, in the years before it was built, you know, his curators would make regular trips from Malibu to Sutton Place, the name of his house, to, you know, bring photographs of these treasures that they wanted him to buy.
Tell us how that working arrangement worked when they would come to his house in England.
Yeah, I spoke to one of his curators, his longtime decorative arts curator, who was a wonderful woman named Jillian, who was English, but she'd moved to Malibu to be his first decorative arts curator kind of around 1970. So several times a year, she would have to fly over to England, go to Sutton Place, and she would come with a stack of you know, photographs to show him of things that she thought that he, you know, should buy. But Getty kept very peculiar hours because a lot of his business, as I said, was in the Middle East. And maybe this is also just his own nocturnal clock. He was a night owl, but he would stay up until like 3 and 4 in the morning on the phone to Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, you know, conducting business. And he expected his staff to be, you know, on call during this time, and also visitors. So poor Jillian Wilson told me she would fly into Sutton Place, be jet lagged, and she'd, you know, have to wait up till at 3 in the morning. Bullymore and the butler would, you know, bang on the door that Mr. Getty will see you now. And so she would have to, you know, and then sometimes she said if he was in a really good mood, he would want to show her his oriental carpets, which meant that in the long gallery. So they'd have to get on their hands and knees, you know, and when she said this funny line, she said, once I just thought, you know, here I am crawling along in the middle of the night with, you know, with the richest man in the Western Hemisphere. This is peculiar.
So I want to switch gears for a second, because they're also described as the tragic dynasty, the Getty curse. So we have to talk about the kidnapping of J. Paul Getty.
Absolutely.
III. So tell us about that.
Yeah, that's the story that's probably best known in a way about the family. This very tragic kidnapping of Paul Getty III. It happened in 1973 in Rome, and that's been the subject of a couple films and other books you might have seen most, you know, recently, several years ago, the movie All the Money in the World. So the family's sort of become best known in a way for that kidnapping, but it's also sort of given them this sort of image as the tragic dynasty, because there have been other deaths in the family, a couple drug-related deaths, unfortunately, some of the other grandchildren. You know, what I found is there definitely has been tragedy for sure in the family, but I really don't think it's accurate to label them the tragic dynasty, because in the main, most of them today are doing just fine, if more than fine. But just going back to the kidnapping, though, it was an immensely traumatic event for the family. I mean, Paul III was 16 at the time, and he was snatched off a street in Rome where his family was living late at night by mafia from the south of Italy, and he was held for 5 months and ended up having his one ear chopped off. That's a particularly gruesome story, but the kidnappers did it to basically show that they were serious. But one of the most gruesome parts of the story is this is common on Italy. This was during one of Italy's very frequent and famous strikes. A postal strike, of all things, happened after the kidnappers put the ear in the mail. So this poor ear, the ear basically languished for about 5 weeks somewhere in a post office. And yeah, I don't mean to gross you out here in the audience, but so about 5 weeks later, but they had sent it to the leading newspaper in Rome. I think it was Il Messaggero. So like 5 weeks later, some poor secretary opens up this and but that was sort of but yeah, but even during the, this whole, like I said, it lasted 5 months, and what I was able to find out, again, some of this was thanks to talking to this woman, Robina Lund, who I mentioned earlier, who was there. She described to me that J. Paul Getty very much wanted to craft the perception that he was heartless to deter other kidnappers from snatching his other. He had 14 other grandchildren.
Because that's the other myth.
Yeah,
he refused to pay a ransom.
Yeah, I mean, it's tied into this. I mean, part of that in a way is true. I mean, he did have. He said, I have 14 other grandchildren. If I pay a penny of ransom, they'll all be kidnapped, potentially next week. And he wanted them to have normal lives. Behind the scenes, as like Robina told me and other people, he was actually negotiating, and he eventually did pay, although he did actually negotiate the ransom sum. But he really wanted, as I said, to create the perception that he was heartless to deter other kidnappers. And in fact, because kidnapping at the time in Italy, kidnapping was epidemic proportions. And interestingly enough, like even in America, just doing some chronology, putting things in chronology. Just after Paul III was released, a month later, Patty Hearst was kidnapped. And shortly after that, an heir to the Bronfman liquor fortune was kidnapped in New York. No other Gettys were ever kidnapped. But in essence, though, so this perception that Getty crafted of his being a heartless was very successful. I think it stuck. But as I found out from people who actually knew him, people who knew him actually liked him, and even his family, other grandchildren, his surviving grandchildren I've talked to had professed to have great love and affection for him. But he, this image of him being this cold, heartless person has persisted.
So I want to switch gears kind of again and talk about California connections to Getty and names that we all know. And we'll come back to Paul III in a few minutes. But tell us about some of the connections with the Newsoms. Now, I was familiar with the Gavin Newsom's father, because he was an appellate court justice just like I was for many, many years. But tell us about the San Francisco connection with names we know: Pelosi, Harris, Gavin Newsom.
No, exactly. No, the relations between those families go back decades. And in the case of relations with the Getty and the Newsom families, I think more than 80 years, in that Gordon, who I mentioned to you earlier, when he and his brother Paul Jr. were growing up in San Francisco, this would have been in the early 1930s, one of their classmates at St. Ignatius was Bill Newsom, the father of Gavin. But in fact, even at the time, J. Paul Getty was off in Europe or the Middle East. He was not present at all. Bill's father and Gavin's grandfather became like a surrogate father to Gordon.
Because Anne wasn't always...
Oh, well, this was much later. I mean, that was much later when Anne came in. But I'm talking about when in the 1930s, when Gordon and his brother were just growing up, because when their own father wasn't there. But so it was really Gavin Newsom's grandfather who was this father figure to them, and they had great affection for him that lasted all their lives. But then, Gordon and his brother Paul, were lifelong best friends of Bill Newsom, who became a judge, who was Gavin's father. And then, Gavin was almost like is like a surrogate son, another son to Gordon, and and his wife Anne. And so when I'm talking going back now, like in the 90s or 80s, when those kids were young, Gavin was always almost like was very much a part of the family, and they all kind of sense that this Gavin had a lot of potential and, for political office. And even early on, they really thought that, I think he had, presidential, might be a presidential timber. Interesting enough, so later when Kamala Harris sort of was brought into the fold, this is much later, by kind of one of one of Gordon's daughter-in-laws. So all of a sudden, she sort of entered the picture, and then, she's kind of theoretically kind of leapfrogged above Gavin, becomes vice president, and it'll be interesting to see, where that story goes. But then the Pelosi's also, and the Gettys have been best friends going back, to the 60s. And interestingly enough, this is long before Nancy had any political ambitions. She was a housewife raising 5 kids. Interesting story. All of those families, they met, they were fascinated by the search for the origins of man and paleoanthropology. And they ended up going to a lecture that Dr. Louis Leakey, who was one of the great pioneering paleoanthropologists, came to San Francisco, and they were all there, and they all became fascinated by his search for the origins of man. And but they started the San Francisco chapter of the Leakey Foundation, and that's how they sort of bonded. But they've basically have been like intimate family ever since. And, as a testament to that, just jumping to a couple years ago, just to show how close the families were, when Ivy, one of the great-granddaughters, was married, not only did Nancy Pelosi officiate, but if you get to, the timing is interesting. The wedding was on a Saturday evening at City Hall under the Great Rotunda in San Francisco. Just the night before, if you remember that $1.8 trillion infrastructure bill that was so hard fought and tumultuous that, Congress, the session lasted until midnight when Nancy, Friday night, finally banged the gavel. Literally, like less than, 24 hours later, she was in a Giorgio Armani pantsuit marrying Ivy Getty in San Francisco.
So there's so many interesting stories, and we're getting close to the end, but I wanted you to talk about Paul Jr. and Talitha, is that how you say her name?
Yeah.
Who I found just fascinating, and I think the Palace de la Zeja, is that?
Right,
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this is, again, one of, he was J. Paul Getty's third-born son, who was, and then it's a little confusing because they're all named Paul. It was really, if you're confused, don't worry, I was too. And, when I had to,
I had to map it out.
I don't know why they did this to us because, when I was doing, there's a family tree in the beginning of my book, which maybe would help you understand. But even so, it's, like I said, they're all named Paul. But Paul Jr., he was first married to his high school sweetheart, Gail, with whom he had his first 4 children. They divorced, and then he married this exotic beauty named Talitha. Her parents were Dutch, but then they moved to England, London, where he met her, and she was just regarded as one of the most beautiful women of her day, and she entranced everyone, men, women, and it was said even men who normally were attracted to women. In fact, Nureyev, apparently she was the only woman that, quote, ever erotically stirred Rudolf Nureyev. I'm just going to say that. But she was bewitching, and anyway, so Paul Jr. married her, and this was sort of like, I'm going to say, late 60s. For about 5 years, they talk about burning their candle at both ends, had the most kind of fabulous, decadent kind of drug, this was the 60s, again, drug-fueled kind of life, but part of it was centered on, they bought this fantastic palace in Marrakesh, which became a place, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Marlon Brando, Yves Saint Laurent,
Jim Morrison.
Yeah, everybody just partied there, and they had this kind of wild life there. But sadly, like a lot of
this is the tragic part.
People, Talitha did overdose, and that sent Paul Jr. into a long and deep depression.
So, again, there's so many stories, and we've got 3 more minutes, and I want to talk about 2 things specifically. Tell us about the headlines in the San Jose Mercury News about Gordon.
Oh, okay. That was a bit of a surprise to some people. Okay, this was in 1999. At that point, Ann and Gordon and the four boys they had, they were sort of the royal family of San Francisco. But one day in, I think, the summer of 1999, the San Jose Mercury News published that Gordon Getty's secret family, 3 daughters, turned out he had been keeping a mistress and had 3 daughters in Los Angeles. These girls were now in the early teenage years, so he had a whole nother family so that was quite tumultuous. I mean, it's a long story. The long and the short of it is, I mean, Anne did come to an understanding with him, and the daughters were very much sort of brought into the family, and they're now equally, a part of the trust. There are many kind of, there's dishy stories in my book you could read. I don't know how much time we have to go into them, but just how Anne, just one thing it's quite a story how Anne found out. Before the Mercury News actually published Gordon, she had found out, and the way she had found out was because they had this family 727. It was one of the most fabulous sort of private planes of the day, and it was nicknamed the Getty. And but the one day it was Anne and Gordon and their 4 boys were at 30,000 feet, but shortly before this, Gordon had actually first confided to his 3rd-born son, John, that he had this other family, because I think John was meant to be the most empathetic of the boys. I think clearly Gordon wanted to sort of, he couldn't just keep, he wanted to sort of telling people, but John kept it to himself for a little while, until this day they were at 30,000 feet, and somehow they got into a family argument, and John just blurted out in front of Anne, "Dad has another family." Now, talk about cabin pressure. You're at 30,000 feet, and so Anne didn't, cause an error. But happily enough, happily ever after, they all got along, man.
So to show you how current the Gettys still are, today in the New York Times, there's an article about some of the Getty family and what they're doing and accomplishing now. And I was really struck by your afterword in the book that everyone here has a copy of, about something that I had heard about that happened at the London National Gallery. Had no idea the connection to the Getty family. So in about 2 minutes, tell us about that.
Okay.
This involves Van Gogh and the sunflower and all of that.
You've probably been hearing about these protests. There's a group called Just Stop Oil, which has been orchestrating a number of these protests to draw attention to the climate emergency. But one of the tactics they've been using is to go to museums and somehow deface art or have some sort of demonstration. But one of the first of these happened in the National Gallery in London about a year and a half ago, and in this case, these young protesters hurled Campbell's soup out of Van Gogh. Now, as it happened, there was protective glass, and as it turns out, they knew there was going to be protective glass, so that the painting wasn't going to be damaged. But it got the worldwide attention, and in fact, it became out that in fact it was one of Getty's granddaughters, Aileen, who had funded this group. Of course, there's the irony that many people drew that the fortune, was built on petroleum fuels.
And you talked to her about
this. I did actually. I mean, she's a fascinating figure for many reasons. And I kind of call her like the ultimate survivor. When she was in her early 20s, married one of Elizabeth Taylor's sons, Christopher Wilding, but then very soon afterwards, she became a drug addict. And in the early 90s, contracted HIV, which was at the time, was often a death sentence. And in fact, in my research, I saw a headline from USA Today in 1991 about her, basically a headline that said, Aileen Getty, doctors tell her she has 6 months to live. Now, imagine reading that about yourself. Fast forward, she is alive today, thriving, and has become, she's used her fortune in many great philanthropic ways, but recently she's just decided that the climate crisis is what she's going to be, wants to throw her resources behind, and so she's the one who basically bankrolled this.
So read the afterword. Sometimes we stop at the conclusion, read it, it brings you up to date. It's fascinating what she told him about why she did this and about her life and her relationship to J. Paul Getty. Great book. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
And can we thank Jamie Cobbler, please? Jamie, thank you so much. Okay, thank you. Okay. All right.
Great
How about
job.
you were terrific. You made it so. Yeah, Liz, I really appreciate it.
It was fun.
Thank you. Wow, we did it.
That was fabulous.
Oh, good.
Okay,
That's so
don't-
good. Okay, where do
don't
we go?
fall off.
Okay.